Now, we all know Salem is the most celebrated Halloween destination in the United States. In fact, it frequently comes in second for Halloween tourism in the entire world, just behind Derry, Ireland. But how did this happen? For centuries, the town did everything it could to avoid discussing the witch trials at all. On a personal note, I've even had a conversation with a Salem shop owner who vividly detailed how all the way up until the day her grandmother died, she would barely talk about the witch hysteria. This is interesting because her grandmother both lived and died in Danvers, which is relevant because a lot of the activity of the Salem witch trials actually occurred in Danvers, not in present-day Salem. And when her grandmother did broach the subject, it was met with disdain, avoidance, and disgust at the burgeoning industry celebrating or maybe even glorifying the city's dark past. So what happened? How did we go from a Salem that avoided these discussions at all costs to one that hosts 500,000 people in October and has so adopted the symbols of its murderous past that they're literally plastered on police uniforms? The answers to those questions are fascinating. Let's begin, as all great things do, with television.
Hi, kids. Look at some delicious magic with the extra good chocolate-flavored syrup, Bosco.
To get started, let's talk about Bewitched. It may seem silly now, but this quirky little comedy was actually pretty groundbreaking for its day. The sitcom debuted in 1964 and followed the adventures of married couple Darren and Samantha Stevens. They were like many young American couples in the 60s, simple, raising a child, and trying to put up with a seemingly ever-present mother-in-law. Oh, and Samantha's a witch and the marriage is bispecial because apparently witches aren't human. This little sitcom went a long way toward transforming the popular culture of the day, and its ripples extend out far beyond the decades in which it aired. In my opinion, if you like Buffy or The Craft or Salem or The Witches of Eastwick or a whole host of other spooky, interestingly witchy media, you have Bewitched to thank for the cultural space in which such things were not only allowed, but celebrated. But for our purposes, Bewitched really succeeded in three ways, each of which helped to kick off the transition of Salem toward its present-day Halloween madness. These were, 1, it featured 2 very powerful and self-determined women, both of whom were generally treated as strong and independently minded members of society. 2, it glorified, celebrated, and even poked fun at the idea of witchcraft. And 3, in a very popular story arc, the show featured Salem itself. Now, before we talk more about Bewitched, if you're a Salem lover, there's likely one question in your head right now: what about The Crucible? Arthur Miller penned the brutal fictionalization of the Salem witch trials in 1952, and it was as much connected to his time as it was to the Puritans. And it's true that the play did begin to replant Salem in the social fabric of the American quilt, but Salem itself was still very much in their quiet place about the hysteria. When Miller visited Salem to research for the play, he even remarked, "You couldn't get anyone to say anything about it." And at the time of Miller's writing, Salem was not doing so hot. Its maritime industry was already dried up for the most part, and manufacturing wasn't going so great either. And then suddenly there was this play, which discussed on an international stage a part of its history that it was still very much ashamed of. One couldn't fault a 1950 Salemite for perhaps believing some long-tortured spirit was enacting centuries-old vengeance on the city for the evils of its past. Then, Bewitched came along in the 60s. After mentioning that the main character had witch ancestors in Salem, the show's writers decided to set a number of episodes there. Samantha and crew venture back in time to the days of the witch trials, where she's promptly accused of and admits to being a witch. Then, using her considerable guile and charms, she both escapes execution and levels the Salem villains by exclaiming, "The people you persecuted were guiltless. They were mortals, just like yourselves. You are the guilty." The Salem chapter of Bewitched was a massive success for the show, and the residents of the town would later realize, albeit with some opposition because this is Salem after all, just how important it had been to their present-day successes. And this is in part why the Samantha Stevens statue was dedicated in Salem in 2005. It didn't take long before the influence of the show became commercialized in Salem, and the renewed cultural focus that Bewitched in many ways sparked had some unexpected benefits only a few years after the airing of the Salem storyline. From here, there are 2 crucial components to the evolution of Salem between the 1960s and today. 1, the American Halloween explosion, and 2, the arrival of the real witches in Salem.
So, it's the 1970s. Up to this point, Salem has largely ignored its witch history. Sure, there have been a few forays into the Witch City tourism market, but nothing significant. 2 Salem-focused episodes of Bewitched have just aired and sparked renewed interest in the town's puritanical past. The 1970s would go on to be the pivotal decade for Halloween's explosion in Salem, but before we get into that, let's have a look at what Halloween was generally like at this time. In the post-World War I United States, money was sprinkled over what we now call the middle class like pixie dust, and this led to a lot of interesting developments, the Roaring Twenties, for example. It was also a significant turning point in the Western commercialization of holidays. It's around this time that Halloween, along with Christmas, Easter, and a few others, start transforming from cute little events you did with your neighbors to cultural signposts that represent us as a people. Salem was, for a long time, reluctant to join in this fun, as were a lot of other New England towns with deep-rooted puritanical belief structures. But eventually, Salem couldn't escape the joyous disintegration of societal norms for one blessed night. So by the time the 1970s rolled around, the soon-to-be-called Witch City was as interested in All Hallows Eve as the next town. While there was no formal citywide celebration of the holiday yet, you'd likely see trick-or-treaters, costumes, and decorations floating around on Samhain Eve. Crucially though, Salem was positioned uniquely to take up the mantle of Halloween Central for a few reasons. First, it was in the mid-1970s in the midst of totally revitalizing its downtown area. This changed a lot of the character of the town, transforming Salem's long thriving Essex Street into a pedestrian walkway meant to encourage shopping and tourism. It failed at first to generate much of either. Second, and most significantly, as we touched on a little bit in the last video, Salem was on the brink of economic failure and had been for some time. Now, something that a lot of tourists don't really seem to understand about the Witch City is that the whole tourism trade is a really recent development. Up until this point in the 1970s, Salem's economic livelihood was provided by an array of industries, none of which were touristy. Some of these include international maritime trade, manufacturing, and a few more. And the remnants of these industries you can still check out in Salem today. I'm sure in time I'm going to have a look at all of these industries here on To Salem. That is yet another reason to subscribe. But for now, just know that by this point, they had pretty much all failed, and Salem was in a bit of an identity crisis. More or less, all it had going for it was the oncoming American Bicentennial celebration in 1976, a year-long tourism boom that many historic cities in New England especially enjoyed the benefits of. So in the early 1970s, Salem has the eyes of America upon it, due largely to The Crucible a couple decades prior and a recent Bewitched storyline. The economic situation is dire in town, with no prominent industries having yet emerged in the wake of the decline of others. Despite the hardship, Salem has geared its central area towards pedestrian foot traffic. Halloween is on the rise as much in Salem as it is everywhere else in America. And speaking of the rest of America, something that is happening there and in Salem is that the countercultural movements of the 1960s have been fully adopted into the fabric of the country at this point, which has led to a greater emphasis on individual fashion, sexuality, and religion, especially among those who were teenagers or in their 20s in that decade. The scene is now set for a huge shift in Salem's cultural, spiritual, and economic identity. Into this now simmering cauldron came the real witches, and what they brought with them would change Salem, Massachusetts forever. It was a small town, previously ashamed of its Puritan history, proud of its maritime contributions to the expansion of America as a global financial force, reeling from the failure of industry after industry, unsure of who it was or who it wanted to be. The pagans came in the early 70s, and in one fell broomstick-riding swoop, they shifted the popular cultural identity away from all of that. And it was at that point that Salem, Massachusetts officially became the Witch City. Halloween in Salem is the equivalent of Mardi Gras in New Orleans, Christmas in Bethlehem, Easter in Rome, or the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. But in all these cases except Salem's, ancient pagan or religious traditions link the place with the festival. There is no such link between Halloween and this Massachusetts town. These are the opening words to Hill's chapter, and I've got to say, they're actually a pretty decent encapsulation of the entire experience of Halloween in Salem. So let's begin, as Hill does, by looking at Salem as a modern pagan mecca, because that story and the story of how Salem became Halloween Central are actually one and the same once you get into the 1970s. Now, it's important to understand that the cultural linkage between Salem and witchcraft never really disappeared post-1692. The lack of clarity in the aftermath of the trials, due to pretty much everyone except the accused doing their level best to pretend like none of it ever happened, led to many concluding that there must have actually been witches in 1692 Salem. And I'm not just talking about Puritan-era America here either. You can draw a straight line between this perception that there were actually witches in 1692 Salem and that run of Bewitched episodes we talked about in part 1 of this series. You can draw an even straighter line between the beliefs that led to the trials occurring in the first place and the TV show Salem, or Sabrina, or Hocus Pocus, or American Horror Story. Each of these stipulate, or in some cases, goes so far as to be narratively dependent on the stipulation, that there were real practitioners of witchcraft in Salem in 1692. This popular perception eventually drew people to the town who claimed to be practitioners of the craft, and those people would go on to, at the very least commercially, change everything. But the pagans weren't the first to seize on the obvious commercial link between Salem and witchcraft. Prior to the 1970s, there were a handful of businesses who flirted with the idea of the Witch City moniker. These included companies from varying industries like fishing, jewelry, a popcorn factory, an oil firm. Even the Parker brothers, who created Monopoly and a bunch of other board games, had a board game called Ye Witchcraft, but they got rid of it when the citizens of Salem revolted. If only those citizens could see Salem now. But perhaps the first attraction in Salem that we would recognize as somewhat witchy was the home of Judge Jonathan Corwin, more commonly known as the Witch House. Now, this is still the only structure in Salem with any direct ties to the witch trials, as it belonged to one of its judges, Jonathan Corwin. But it wasn't really marketed as such until well into the 20th century. Again, quoting from Francis Hill here, in 1944, city plans necessitated either demolishing or moving the building. They relocated it by a few yards, restored the house, and opened it to the public. The organization renamed the building the Witch House to attract as many tourists as possible. So this happens in the mid-40s, and then about 2 to 3 decades later, just as that Bewitched Salem run is gearing up for release, the now infamous Witch City logo starts popping up on a bunch of different merchandising in town. But look, in truth, we can examine a whole host of elements in this fascinating history. We can talk about the witch trials, Bewitched, attempts to commercialize the tragedy that pop up here and there, the rise of Halloween in general, the Crucible. We can examine each of these things in depth and assign some minimal level of responsibility for the spookifying of Salem, Massachusetts. But at the end of the day, there is one person more responsible than any other for what Salem in October has become. Her name is Laurie Cabot. She's a practicing witch, and in 1971, she came to Salem, Massachusetts. She brought with her a small group and opened a witch shop. Now, the buzz around her and her coven was instant. Suddenly, not only were there real witches in Salem, but they were out and proud witches. Cabot went on to open more witch shops and was even declared the official witch of Salem after self-filing a petition to name her as such. Cabot's witch style was clearly influenced by her era and the works of people like Gerald Gardner, and would go on to be foundational stylistically and commercially for every single witch who has migrated to Salem since. When you go to Salem and you pass the 15th witch shop in a row and you're wondering how that happened, Laurie Cabot is how. In 1972, which is 1 year after she moved to Salem, the Salem Witch Museum opened its doors, and you can learn more about how that happened by watching this video if you'd like. A decade later, the first Haunted Happening celebration in Salem was launched by that same museum with the support and engagement of Cabot and her followers. Salem in the 70s and 80s proved to be the perfect cauldron in which to brew a total industry shift. Now, as we've already talked about, the industrial era in Salem was coming to a close. it was a city at this point without a real identity. And by the time the Haunted Happenings celebrations got extended from one night to a few days a week to a month-long affair, the Salem that was no more, and the town's new masters were covered in Aquanet and eyeliner. There was a backlash, of course, to the change in the city. It was so rapid and so all-encompassing. People spoke out. A debate began that still rages to this day in Salem. It's a debate about the value of historical diversity, honoring the lives of those who have been viciously murdered, and the preservation of authentic culture versus financial expansion, self-expression, and religious freedom. It's a debate about the nature of witchcraft itself and how it is presented in relation to the Puritans, the local pagans, and the tourists of Salem. It's a debate about outsiders and newcomers. It's a debate about the very soul of a place. And apart from the stalwart efforts of a few outstanding institutions like the Peabody Essex Museum, it sure seems to a fascinated observer that the witches won that debate. By many accounts, 1992 was really the last time the actual event of the Salem witch trials was treated with anything resembling absolute civic and cultural dignity. Now, that was the tercentenary, the 300-year anniversary of the trials. Arthur Miller came in, as well as Elie Wiesel, to speak. There were 2 memorials erected in somber remembrance. And later, about a decade and a half or so later, the site of the actual hangings themselves were confirmed, and it too was memorialized. Now, I wasn't there in 1992, but if you take a look at the memorial that was erected in downtown Salem and you look at pictures and you read accounts from that day, you really do get a sense that this was as respectful of a remembrance as it could possibly be toward the 20 people who were murdered during the Salem witch trials. Unfortunately, this sort of reverent tone didn't last long. In 1993, a new Office of Tourism and Cultural Affairs was founded, and although it initially tried to embrace historical diversity and a more dignified approach, it soon found itself promoting Halloween just as much as its more varied counterparts. Around this time, too, the Peabody Essex Museum had already sort of planted its flag in the sand and said, we are going to stand for something different, for a different culture, different history than that relating to Halloween and the 1692 witch trials. So that left a vacuum for other quote-unquote museums to step in and fill the void. We talk about these attractions a lot here on this channel. Some of them are incredible, some of them are not so incredible. But it's important here to understand that an institution like the Peabody Essex Museum is trying to strive for a higher goal than profit alone. And these smaller institutions may or may not be trying to do that same thing. But as of right now in Salem, still, these places can call themselves museums and sort of latch onto that culturally accepted idea of what a museum is without any sort of restriction. So by the mid-90s, you've got witch shops everywhere, you've got these attractions everywhere, you've got people selling shirts. The whole thing has really blown up. So if the 1970s was the beginning of the major events that led to Salem becoming Halloween Central, I think we can pretty comfortably say that the year after the tercentenary, which would be 1993, was the end. By this point, Salem was resembling, or on its way toward resembling, what it is today. Streets were crowded with attractions, Haunted Happenings has expanded well beyond its initial scope, and the tourism has become the central industry in Salem, Massachusetts. Today, Halloween is an absolute free-for-all in 2019. Current estimates claim that around half of Salem's annual tourism comes in the month of October. And I've also read in some places that half of that comes around Halloween itself. I know from my experience, the first time I visited the Witch City was around Halloween, and in truth, that was the entire reason I went. But now that I've seen that there's so much more beneath the surface, I do kind of wish I had known that before the first trip. I've been fortunate to go back to Salem many, many times, but I often do wonder about the 13-year-old girl from central Illinois who visits Salem with her parents on Halloween. With only a weekend on the Salem streets, what conclusions has she drawn as she winds her way back to the airport? Has she been enthralled with a deep, layered cultural history? Has she been enchanted with the sort of surface pizzazz of the whole thing? Has she found a place worth returning to, or a grotesque amusement? as easily discarded as she gets into her teenage years and early adulthood as all the rest? Whatever side of these questions you ultimately come down on, one thing that cannot be argued is that Salem, Massachusetts is and has been for quite some time Halloween Central USA, and now you know how that happened.